At the end of this video, I want you to watch this video at the start. The URL is on the screen there, and it will be posted in Blackboard. This video is about the nature of expert knowledge. Think about it as you're watching this video. Are experts reliable? What you'll see in this video, of course, is that experts can be fooled. But I want you to think about why were they fooled? In this case, they were swayed by what they expected to find. In a true taste test, the labels would be hidden. But this is a good example of how biases can affect research. The point here is to think critically and analytically as you do your research. Think critically about both the articles and information you are using, as well as how you are putting together your argument and evidence. Becoming a critical thinker is important to your writing. To develop this skill, you need to ask lots of questions. You need to ask questions about the different types of knowledge. So first, what is the difference between authoritarian knowledge and experiential knowledge? Second, do you consider any superstitions to be true? Use a critical thinking perspective. Ask yourself what factual basis exists for those superstitions that you believe. Third, when you select an article from a recognized publication, whether it's academic, peer-reviewed journal, or a piece from a major newspaper or a news magazine like Maclean's, you need to review it from a critical thinking perspective. Are the sources documented? Can you trace back the research? Are the methods transparent and can they be replicated? What is your reaction to the writing? Fourth, you should also consider which authorities are recognized in your field of study. Different fields will place more or less value on different types of experts. So if you're writing an education essay about curriculum and pedagogy, do you turn to an expert in teaching and learning, or do you use research by a criminal psychologist? While in some cases there may be overlap, for example, curriculum suited for young people convicted of violent crimes, for the most part you will use experts in the field of research you are conducting. Finally, fifth, you should also consider how culturally obtained knowledge shapes your belief systems. In other words, how does your cultural background shape the way you view the world? All in all, you want to make critical thinking a habit, something you do almost without thinking about it. So to develop these critical thinking skills, you want to evaluate your information from many different perspectives, which means asking questions about methodology, expertise, and so on. You want to be an active learner, which means asking questions to clarify information, especially when you're uncertain about some aspect of it. Don't assume everybody else knows what's going on except for you. Ask questions. You will need to recognize both your own assumptions as well as the assumptions of other people. You also need to be open-minded when you encounter new information. Don't automatically think something like, "We don't believe that in my culture or religion." Ask yourself why. Why don't you believe it? And is there anything I can learn from this new information? In other words, don't jump to conclusions without asking a lot of questions and looking at the information from many different perspectives. As you're preparing your documents, when you're writing, doing the research, therefore, you're using your research skills to investigate and find sources of information to support your argument. You're also using your critical thinking skills to evaluate the information that you find. Let's think for a minute about the different types of sources you may encounter. There are two types of sources: primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources are those artifacts and documents that were created at the time of the event. These could be letters, posters, books, laws, and so on. Secondary sources are those things that are created later, after the event is over. These are the scholarly books and journals that you will use most often in your university research. Now, it's sometimes easiest to think about the difference between the two types if you think about historical research. Documents like letters or published articles and books published at the time that is being studied, or photographs taken at that time, would all be considered primary sources. For example, if you were studying the nature of education in the 1860s in Ontario, you could use letters written by teachers to the Department of Education. You could use articles written by Egerton Ryerson and published at the time in newspapers or magazines, and photographs of schools or classes of students taken in the 1860s. You could use these primary source documents to analyze what was being said about education at the time, and use the images to view the structure of the buildings, the size of the classes, how children were dressed, and so on. Secondary sources, however, would be an article or a book that I, as a historian, have written in the 2000s about education in the 1860s. I would have used primary source documents to write my article, but for you as a student, the article that I wrote, my article, is a secondary source. What about websites? There are considerable amounts of information available online, but is all of it reliable? As a rule of thumb, if you find information online at a website that is not scholarly, so this could be a blog or a site publishing student essays, but it is something you think is important, track the information back to its original source. You can use the questions we've already discussed about accuracy, authority, objectivity, currency, and coverage to assess the websites that you find. However, it can be easy to be tricked into thinking that some site or piece of information is authoritative and reliable. Let's consider Wikipedia for a second. While there is some evidence that the information on Wikipedia is fairly reliable, because anyone can edit wiki entries, there is always a question of whether or not some piece of information will be accurate. More importantly for you as a university student, Wikipedia is a type of encyclopedia. While encyclopedias may have been acceptable in primary and secondary school, they are no longer acceptable sources at university. Like textbooks, encyclopedias boil information down, losing their nuances and complexity of argument and research. While you may want to use an encyclopedia to kick off research on a topic you know nothing about, you should never be using it as a source. Don't quote it or cite it. Go to the sources that were cited in the encyclopedia. A good encyclopedia will provide sources of information which you can then track down. They will also be helpful or useful in helping you to come up with search terms to use in the journal databases at the library, because of course the journal databases are what you should be using. Now there's other similar websites such as about.com, howstuffworks.com, and the like. You should not be using any of those sources as sources. So, at the end of this video, take some time to assess a few websites. Which ones are scholarly sources? Which are examples of journalism? If you think something has good information but is not a scholarly source, what could you do? Huffington Post, for example, is a newspaper. So although you may agree with the perspectives presented and think they are reliable, it is considered to be journalism, not a scholarly source. What about TED.com? There are many important theorists and researchers showcased here. You could also use the information you find here, but use it carefully and sparingly, so not too often. You must also take the time to look up publications by that person. Try to find peer-reviewed articles about the information you've found. Sometimes the topic may be too new and cutting edge, so you may not find published sources. You can still use the information, but when you write about it, frame the information to indicate the nature of the source. What about Statistics Canada? Of course, this is a reliable source and may be used to provide statistical evidence. So, bottom line, be critical and analytical for all sources that you encounter. In this video, we've discussed some of the underlying concerns about using sources in your research and writing. We have discussed the difference between objectivity and subjectivity, the sources of our knowledge, critical thinking, and how to apply it when conducting research, as well as a few types of sources you may encounter. We ended with a consideration of how to assess and make use of websites. Thank you for listening.